Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. The Center for Security, Race and Rights engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. You can learn more about CSRR's work by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Today's episode is entitled Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians, featuring an in-depth discussion of the book by political scientist Khaled Elgindy. Mr. Elgindy discusses the complex dynamics of U.S. involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the significant pressure to unconditionally support Israel by American Zionist political action committees and politicians. Mr. Elgindy also explores the historical context and consequences of America's substantial financial and diplomatic investment in pursuing a two-state solution. Notwithstanding that Israel's military assault on Gaza in the past 12 months makes the creation of a Palestinian state a near impossibility. Let's hear what our guest has to say about this timely topic that shapes U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Thank you to all of you for coming out this afternoon. What I thought I would do today is I thought I would talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and diplomatic process, and talk a lot about how we got here, because I think that's the more interesting story, and then offer up some thoughts on where I think things might be headed. First of all, to state the obvious, the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians is dead. The more surprising issue, however, is that it wasn't Donald Trump who killed it. Rather, the process died a slow, torturous death over the past 2 decades, and by the time Trump arrived, it had already ceased to function for all intents and purposes. So what exactly is the Trump approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, the first component of the so-called deal of the century, as the administration has called it, was unveiled a few months ago in Bahrain, in one of the wealthy Arab Gulf states, at a workshop in which the United States put forward a vision of about $50 billion, that's 50 billion with a B, in aid, development, and investment projects for Palestinians and neighboring Arab states. The Palestinians, of course, did not attend. They have boycotted the Trump administration since December 2017, when Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, thereby reversing 70 years of U.S. policy and bucking an international consensus with regard to Jerusalem. In response, the United States imposed sanctions on the Palestinians, cutting all forms of aid, including to Palestinian refugees, and shut down the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C. The political component of Donald Trump's peace plan has been repeatedly delayed and has now been indefinitely postponed. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's just the same. The details of the plan don't really matter because we already know what's in it, or rather what's not in it. We know, for example, that Jerusalem is not on the table. We know that because Donald Trump told us Jerusalem is now off the table, which means that, of course, that there is no future Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. We know that the administration is busy trying to take another important issue, that of Palestinian refugees. Roughly 5 million Palestinian refugees today who are descended from or are Palestinians who were expelled or otherwise fled their homes in 1948 during Israel's creation. They're also trying to take that issue off the table, in essence, by redefining who is and isn't a Palestinian refugee to basically define them out of existence. We also know that their vision does not include a sovereign Palestinian state, as the past 3 U.S. presidents have pursued, and nor are they talking about an end to Israel's occupation. In short, all of the substantive issues that Palestinians care about, Jerusalem, refugees, freedom, statehood, are now off the table. Just to give you a sense of where realities on the ground today, of course, the reality on the ground sort of parallels the political diplomatic process all of the trends are basically working against a two-state solution. The settlement enterprise has been a huge success. Gaza remains isolated and impoverished and on the verge of economic and humanitarian disaster. The West Bank remains a fragmented sea of discontiguous Palestinian-controlled areas in a sea of Israeli army and settler control. You can see on the map about 3.2 million Palestinians concentrated in about 40% of the West Bank, while the remaining 60% is reserved for, of course, the Israeli army, but primarily for the settler population, which is, of course, a fraction of the Palestinians. This is the reality that exists on the ground today. So how did we get here? As I said, it wasn't Trump who killed the peace process. Rather, it was a slow kind of I would describe it as a death by a thousand cuts, in which all three of the last administrations contributed to the demise of the process. Mostly Bill Clinton and George W. Bush in particular, who I think did the most damage to prospects for a peaceful resolution based on a two-state solution. And by the time Barack Obama arrived, the peace process was hemorrhaging severely. And although he didn't contribute to stabbing the process, as it were, he did basically let it bleed out. Trump claims that he's embarked on a radical new approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in a lot of ways, it is new, but I think it's new in terms of the severity and degree rather than the substance or the nature of the policies that he's pursuing. In fact, I would say it's not really a new approach, but in fact, the culmination of the old approach. Even though the peace process is no longer based on the Land for Peace formula that has been the basis of U.S. policy and the peace process since 1967, as enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242, those basic ground rules of the peace process have already been eroded quite severely by the previous three presidents. It's true that Donald Trump doesn't even recognize the existence of an occupation. That was a term that they have basically scrubbed from State Department documents and so forth. But for years, U.S. administrations have basically downplayed the centrality of Israel's occupation in terms of what motivates and animates this conflict, and instead have focused on secondary issues like building up Palestinian institutions, economics, and of course, security. Even the Jerusalem Embassy Act and the law that required the administration or that allowed the administration to shut down the PLO embassy in Washington were products of the Oslo process, both of which were enacted in the 1990s at the height of the Oslo process, a reminder that the peace process has always been shaped not just by its champions, but as much and sometimes more by its opponents. To understand why the Oslo process failed, we have to look at the unique nature of American mediation. In any normal mediation, the mediator assesses the dynamics between the two parties, particularly the power dynamics. There's always one party that is stronger, looks at the internal constraints on the two parties, particularly from their domestic politics, and then uses those to find incentives and disincentives that will encourage the parties to move in the direction of the goals of the peace process. But that's not how American mediation worked. American mediation instead was based on what I consider to be two faulty assumptions. The first is that for peace to succeed, for the process to succeed, Israel must feel secure militarily, politically, and otherwise in order to, quote, take risks for peace. The second is that Palestinian internal politics, rather than being accommodated, should either be ignored or perhaps even re-engineered to meet the needs or the perceived needs of the peace process. Both of these concepts make up the two sides of what I call the blind spot. On the one hand, the tendency to downplay the enormous power asymmetry between the two sides. After all, we're not just talking about a conflict. We're talking about an occupation. We're talking about a situation where one party rules over militarily the other side. And the other tendency, of course, is this almost total disregard to internal Palestinian political dynamics, in stark contrast to the high degree of sensitivity to internal Israeli politics. Both of these principles, as it turns out, go back probably 100 years, which is why I look at the whole 100-year process since the Balfour Declaration, but more specifically to Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s, who, as a very powerful Secretary of State, shaped not only the Arab-Israeli peace process, but in many ways is the godfather of American policy toward the Palestinians. I mean, this idea, his contribution was to reinforce this notion that peace requires a preeminent Israel and United States, that, in other words, power matters, but it needs to be preserved. The power dynamics need to be preserved. And secondly, that Palestinian politics is not something to be accommodated or political aspirations, but rather avoided and perhaps even changed with the view that Palestinian politics is more akin to a pathology than it is to something that needs to be incorporated into the process. In practice, this meant two things. First was this constant tension between the needs of the peace process and U.S. interests on one hand, usually as determined by the State Department and the intelligence community, and the demands of the special relationship between the United States and Israel and of domestic politics, including the inordinate influence of the pro-Israel lobby in Washington. The result is you have American policy being pulled in two different directions. And this ambivalence actually is at the core of the failure of American mediation. It also meant that the two strongest parties, namely the United States and Israel, had both the means and the motive to shift as many of the political costs and risks as possible onto the weaker party, that is the Palestinians. As a result, since 1993, successive American administrations have ended up working both for and against the goals of the peace process at the same time. President Clinton, for example, in my view, represents both the best and the worst of what American mediation had to offer. On the one hand, he shattered old taboos, brought Yasser Arafat and the PLO in from the cold, normalized dealings with Palestinian political leaders in American politics to a certain degree. But at the same time, he broke with old important legal and political precedents, namely UN General Assembly Resolution 194, in which is enshrined the Palestinian right to return to their homes, the rights of Palestinian refugees. Clinton was the first U.S. administration to stop reaffirming that resolution, which was taking place each year at the United Nations. And he was also the first president to stop referring to Israeli settlements as obstacles to peace, even though he still opposed Israeli settlements, but they weren't necessarily an obstacle to peace. Sort of makes you wonder, well, why oppose them? But Clinton's biggest contribution came in the final months of his administration following the collapse of the Camp David negotiations, the summit that took place in July 2000, and a few months later was followed by the outbreak of violence in what is now known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada in the fall of 2000. Even though it was clear that all sides made mistakes, both in terms of the collapse of the peace negotiations and in terms of the cycle of violence, the United States and the Clinton administration pinned the lion's share of the blame on the weakest party, on the Palestinians. It's understandable why he would do so, given the very close relationship that Clinton had with the Israeli prime minister, with Ehud Barak, and of course the long-standing special relationship with the Israelis. But it had major repercussions nonetheless, specifically in terms of narrowing the political space for achieving a breakthrough in the final months of Clinton's administration, and in sort of reaffirming this notion that Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians are not actually genuine partners for peace. The no partner narrative has dominated the American discourse really in the policy world since 2000. But as I said, I think no president has done more to harm the peace process and prospects for a two-state solution than George W. Bush. On the one hand, Bush was the very first president to make a two-state solution official U.S. policy in calling for a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. But at the same time, he also gave Ariel Sharon, then prime minister in the early 2000s, Israeli prime minister, basically a green light to systematically destroy Palestinian governing and security institutions in the name of fighting terrorism. And if you remember, this was in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. We also, under George Bush, saw a return to the Kissinger model of Palestinian politics as a pathology. Specifically, we see that in the demand by President Bush that before there could be any new peace negotiations, Palestinians would have to elect new leaders that were, quote, not compromised by terror. And of course, pinned most of the responsibility for ending the violence on the Palestinians. Yet even when Palestinians did elect new leaders, in 2005, elected Mahmoud Abbas, who replaced the deceased Yasser Arafat, and brought an end to the uprising in that same year, there still was no movement on the diplomatic front on the part of the United States. Most telling of all, I think one of the greatest paradoxes of the Bush administration is that they were the primary author of the peace plan known as the Roadmap, the International Roadmap, sponsored by the United States, Russia, the EU, and the UN, and yet were the first country to abandon it almost immediately. The biggest test, however, I think, for the Bush administration came after Hamas's election in what everyone viewed as a very democratic, free and fair election in 2006. Rather than using the election of Hamas, which of course is a militant group involved in armed attacks on Israelis, including Israeli civilians, but instead of using that as an opportunity to build on or perhaps even test Hamas's moderation, the Bush administration adopted a zero-sum approach and insisted that there was no possibility of Hamas being part of any government, even a unity government with the ruling party of Mahmoud Abbas of Fatah. This put Mahmoud Abbas in the impossible position of having to choose either between negating the results of a democratic election or facing indefinite international isolation. The result was a Palestinian civil war in which Hamas came out on top, seized control of the Gaza Strip forcibly, and expelled the Palestinian Authority from that part of the West Bank. And ever since then, we've had this blockade imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip. By the time Obama comes to office, both the peace process and Palestinian politics are in shambles. Obama came in to office just a few days after the end of the Gaza War, known as Cast-Led, in which about 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 Palestinian homes destroyed, massive destruction to the already fragile infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, as well as 13 Israelis, including 3 civilians who were killed during that conflict. We saw a return of the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was even far more committed to settlements and the settlement enterprise than most of his predecessors. And on the other side of the equation, of course, is this divided and dysfunctional Palestinian leadership. Any success towards a negotiated settlement between the parties would require a radical new approach. And at first, it looked like Obama might actually be willing to chart a different course than his predecessors. He took a firm stand on Israeli settlements and even alluded to the possibility of ending the siege on the Gaza Strip. However, as soon as he got pushback from the usual quarters, namely the Congress and pro-Israel forces in Washington, as well as, of course, the Israeli government, he dropped the issue and essentially shifted into neutral. Obama had, in fact, many opportunities either to break new ground or even to leave his imprint on the peace process. Instead, he not only opted for a minimalist approach, but actually worked to preserve the status quo in a number of ways. One of the biggest paradoxes of the Obama presidency occurred in 2011 and 2012. In that year, President Mahmoud Abbas went to the United Nations in the hopes of getting recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations. First, in the Security Council, which, of course, he couldn't achieve given the U.S. veto, and then in the General Assembly, where he did achieve that goal of getting of Palestine recognized as a non-state, as a non-member state of the United Nations. Yet even as the Obama administration had kind of given up on the idea of a settlement freeze and put no political or diplomatic effort into pursuing that goal, the Obama administration expended enormous resources, diplomatically and otherwise, in trying to defeat these UN bids, which, after all, were symbolic, but more importantly, they were affirming the goal of a two-state solution. Unlike settlements, of course, which everyone understood were directly physically harming the process or the goal of a Palestinian state. By 2013, a peace process existed only in name. Prime Minister Salam Fayyad's very successful state-building project was hailed by all sides as a great success, and yet produced no progress toward Palestinian statehood. Instead, Palestinians got even more sanctions in response to their daring to go to the United Nations. By 2014, we saw the collapse of negotiations, again sponsored by Secretary John Kerry, and shortly thereafter, the outbreak of yet another deadly Gaza war that summer. So in a very real way, we had neither peace nor process. Attempts at resolving the conflict had failed, and even the more humble or the more modest goal of controlling or damaging managing the conflict also had failed. Yet even with the clock winding down and a President-elect Trump waiting in the wings, Obama once again opted for the minimum. Instead of pursuing bold or ambitious options like recognizing a Palestinian state or putting forward his own vision of permanent status parameters on how to bring about a two-state solution, Obama simply authorized his representative at the UN to abstain from a Security Council resolution that condemned Israeli settlements. By the time, basically, the inertia and minimalism of the Obama years left an opening for Donald Trump. And as we've seen, he has not been as committed or actually committed at all to a two-state solution or to the principles that undergird it. In effect, Donald Trump is trying to redefine the conflict and turn back the clock, not to the pre-Oslo era, but rather to the pre-1967 era when Palestinians were viewed exclusively as an economic, humanitarian, and especially as a security problem rather than a political one. In short, the peace process failed because it was totally divorced from reality and created a system of accountability for only one side, the weaker side. Palestinian compliance rarely brought rewards, Israeli violations and excesses rarely carried any costs. While U.S. officials remained vigilant in holding Palestinians accountable, they rarely, if ever, did so for Israel, not for its settlement activities and certainly not for its human rights violations. It's a simple rule of law issue. I think something all of you can appreciate. If the rules are applied only to one side and it's the weaker side, the process loses all meaning and credibility and in fact cannot function. So where do we go from here? As I said, the peace process is dead, but that doesn't mean that a two-state solution is necessarily dead. I think two states is still theoretically possible, although it's hard to imagine how we get there without a credible process. I think it's also clear that the United States has been discredited as a mediator, certainly by the Palestinians and the broader Arab world, but many in Europe as well. And even a few folks like me in Washington have arrived at that conclusion. At the same time, there is no clear or viable alternative to the United States. There is currently no single party that has the kind of credibility with all sides, particularly the Israelis, who can be an effective mediator in this conflict. On the one hand, Israeli leaders remain triumphalist and have no incentive to compromise. On the other hand, this kind of is in stark contrast to the Palestinian leadership and its structural weakness, which remains divided and dysfunctional. The PLO has been hollowed out. The Palestinian Authority is not far behind and is on the verge of collapse. And as we've seen, the Palestinian leadership lacks any alternative strategy or vision. At the same time, a one-state solution based on equal citizenship rights for all is not yet politically viable, both because the vast majority of Israeli Jews reject the concept, but also because even on the Palestinian side, we don't have a clear, credible political actor that is championing the cause one state, one person, one vote in one state. However, the situation is not all doom and gloom. The blind spot may in fact be giving way to a bright spot, however modest. While it's clear that Trump is trying to rewrite the rules of the game and redefine the conflict, there are a few important obstacles that stand in his way. The first is that the international community is unlikely to go along. We've seen that on issues like Jerusalem and Palestinian refugees, that the United States and Israel remain the outliers on these issues. There's still a very strong consensus, both in support of Palestinian refugee rights and in terms of Palestinian statehood, genuine Palestinian statehood. More importantly, we've seen important changes in American politics. There's a growing partisan divide that is opening up new space for debate. For the first time ever, really, we're seeing the emergence of a political constituency that cares about Palestinian rights. We see that reflected in the current presidential campaign, in which a number of Democratic candidates have talked about conditioning aid to Israel for the first time. This is unprecedented in an electoral context. All of these present an opportunity to dramatically change the conversation on Israel and Palestine, and eventually, perhaps, to change U.S. policy toward the conflict. For the time being, however, I think it's pointless to talk about a return to negotiations or even about a U.S.-led peace process. I think our goal ought to be much more modest. In my view, the first priority is simply to have an honest and frank debate, something we've not had at the political level in many, many decades, including a debate that takes stock of past failures. That debate can no longer simply be an intra-Israeli or intra-Zionist debate, but must also include voices that prioritize Palestinian rights, aspirations, and narratives. And in many ways, I think that process has already begun. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.